I never expected my quiet cul-de-sac to become the battleground for a war I never asked for. But the moment I opened that letter, stamped with the HOA's official seal, and a warning I still remember word for word, I knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just a fine. It wasn't just a violation. It was the beginning of a campaign meant to break me, bleed me dry, and force me out of the home I'd built from the ground up. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a typo, a mix-up, but then came the late-night inspections, the anonymous complaints, the sudden changes to rules that had never existed before. Neighbors I'd known for years stopped meeting my eyes. And the HOA board. They watched me like they were waiting for something. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to uncover a secret so big, so buried, that people were willing to destroy anyone who got close to it. And the real question isn't how it started. It's how far they were willing to go to make sure I never fought back. Before everything unraveled, before the fines, the threats, the meetings behind closed doors. I used to think my neighborhood was the last place anything dramatic could ever happen. It was the kind of community real estate brochures loved to brag about: tree-lined sidewalks, neighbors who waved when they drove by, manicured lawns so uniform they looked like they'd been cloned. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, predictable, and safe. And after spending years saving every spare dollar and working weekends to make the down payment, I felt like I had finally carved out a stable corner of the world for myself. My home sat on the far end of a quiet loop road, tucked between a small greenbelt and a lake view that caught the evening light just right. I had spent my first few months there building raised garden beds, painting the porch railings by hand, and redoing the old deck board by board. There was a satisfaction in shaping something with your own effort. Something permanent. Every improvement made the house feel more like mine. Something earned rather than inherited or handed over. Most of my neighbors kept to themselves, but they were pleasant enough. An older couple across the street always waved from their rocking chairs. A young family sometimes took evening walks with their kids and dogs. If any of them had strong opinions about me or my home, they never showed it. Not then. Not yet. The HOA existed. Of course. It always does in places like this. But at first it felt like little more than background noise. A pamphlet in the welcome packet, a list of rules about paint colors and parking, the occasional newsletter about community BBQs that never seemed to actually happen. I remember thinking it was harmless. Maybe even helpful. After all, who doesn't want a neighborhood that looks nice? And if a board of volunteers wanted to spend their time enforcing those standards, more power to them. I had no reason to believe otherwise. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Early mornings, coffee on the porch, long workdays, late dinners, and quiet weekends. If anything unusual happened in the community, it never reached me. I paid my dues on time, kept my yard neat, stayed out of drama, and followed the rules. Not because I feared consequences, but because I believed in being a good neighbor. The idea that those same rules would one day be twisted and weaponized against me felt impossible. Unthinkable. The first signs were small. So small I brushed them off without a second thought. A car parked on the street too long. A lawn slightly too patchy. A fence that could use a fresh coat of paint. These were the kinds of things the HOA occasionally sent reminders about to the whole community. Not violations, just courtesy notices, usually signed by someone on the board whose name I didn't recognize. I tossed them aside and assumed everyone else got the same ones. I should have paid more attention, because while the rest of the neighborhood received friendly reminders, Mine were different. More pointed. More specific. They were addressed only to me, written in oddly formal language, and delivered not by mail, but tucked directly into my doorframe. Like someone walked up to my house, placed it there, and left without knocking. At the time, I shrugged it off as overzealous rule keeping, the kind of thing bored retirees might do for entertainment. Annoying, sure, but harmless. Looking back, it was the first tap on the shoulder before the real push. The HOA president at the time was a man named Gerald. Someone I had never met, but had seen occasionally walking briskly around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, always taking notes. His posture was stiff, overly upright, like he carried the weight of the entire community on his shoulders and believed only he was capable of bearing it. From what little I heard, he had lived in the neighborhood for years and ran the HOA with a level of enthusiasm most people reserved for careers or hobbies they actually enjoyed. He treated the bylaws like scripture and the homeowners like children who needed constant supervision. Still, he never approached me directly. Never said a word, just observed from a distance, always looking, always evaluating. It made me uneasy, but I told myself I was imagining it. Not everyone who stares at you from across the street is planning something. Sometimes people are just people. The board itself operated like a small committee of true believers. Individuals who attended meetings religiously and seemed to treat HOA policies as matters of life and death. Every community has them, the rule enforcers, the busybodies, the self-appointed guardians of property values. But even they seemed harmless at first, more bureaucratic than malicious. My turning point arrived the day I decided to expand my garden. It should have been simple. I added a second raised bed, near the side of the house, identical to the one already approved during my first year. Same design, same placement relative to the fence, same materials. It never occurred to me that a matching addition would require any special permission. Not when the first one had been greenlit without issue. So I built it, filled it with soil, and planted tomatoes, peppers, and basil. A small act, a personal project. Something that brought me peace. 3 days later, I found the first violation notice. Not a courtesy reminder. Not a suggestion. A bold, threatening letter accusing me of unauthorized modification of property affecting community aesthetics. The tone was cold, accusatory, and strangely urgent, as if my small garden bed was some kind of emergency that demanded immediate correction. A $50 fine was attached, along with a warning that further non-compliance could result in additional penalties, lien proceedings, or legal action. It didn't make sense. I stared at the notice for a long time, trying to understand how something so ordinary could provoke such a response. I walked out to the garden more times than I can count, examining it from every angle. It wasn't blocking any walkway. It wasn't visible from the street. It wasn't breaking any stated rules. And more importantly, it was fully in line with what the HOA had previously approved. But the letter didn't care about logic. It wasn't asking me to fix a problem. It was daring me to push back. I emailed the board asking for clarification, attaching photos, measurements, and the original approval documents for the first garden bed. Days passed with no response. Not even an acknowledgement. When a reply finally came, it was from a generic HOA email address with no name attached and only one sentence. Your violation stands pending review. Review by who? When? According to what rules? None of those questions were answered. Instead, the next week brought another notice. And then another. And then another. Each more aggressive than the last. Suddenly, things I had never been warned about became urgent issues. the color of my porch trim, the height of my shrubs, the placement of my trash bins. Infractions that had never been a problem before were now treated like criminal offenses, each accompanied by a fine or threat of escalating action. It began to feel coordinated, deliberate, targeted. But I wasn't ready to believe that yet. Because the truth is, most people don't wake up expecting their neighbors to become adversaries. We want to believe in good intentions, in misunderstandings, in simple mistakes. It's easier than admitting someone might want to cause trouble for no logical reason at all. Still, the pressure grew. I could feel eyes on me whenever I stepped outside. Conversations hushed as I approached. People I once waved to now looked away or quickly retreated indoors. It was as if some invisible line had been drawn around my property, and everyone else had silently agreed to stay on the other side of it. Then, the nighttime inspections began. I'd hear footsteps on gravel, the faint click of a camera, the rustle of bushes. Always late, always quiet, always just long enough to make my skin crawl. I'd step outside and find no one, only the lingering sense that someone had been standing there moments earlier. Someone who didn't want to be seen. All the while, the HOA letters grew more frequent and more hostile. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were documenting everything. Collecting evidence. Building a narrative. One designed to trap me inside a maze of technicalities, fees, and accusations until I either complied completely or cracked under pressure. But at that point, I still believed I was dealing with petty power trips, not something larger. Not something dangerous. Not something that could unravel not just my peace, but my entire life. The turning point, the moment everything snapped into focus, came in the form of a document I wasn't meant to see. A document that hinted the board's obsession with me wasn't random at all. That it wasn't about garden beds, or trash bins, or porch paint. It was about something far bigger. Something buried. Something worth protecting at any cost. And standing at the edge of that discovery, I had no way of knowing just how deep it went, or how far the people behind it were willing to go to keep it hidden. Because my HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. It was guarding a secret. And I was about to become the biggest threat they'd ever faced. The day I found the document wedged beneath my welcome mat, everything shifted. It was a printed agenda from an HOA board meeting. One I hadn't attended, one I hadn't even known was happening. My name appeared on it 3 times, each underlined, each beside vague phrases like ongoing review, pending action, and priority enforcement. In a community of over 80 homes. The only resident singled out on that sheet was me. It was the first undeniable sign that what I'd been experiencing wasn't random oversight or simple misunderstanding. It was targeted, coordinated, deliberately planned, and the moment I realized that, the HOA escalated. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a bright orange tow truck creeping along the road in front of my house. Its engine hummed, low and patient, like it was stalking something. When I stepped onto my porch, I saw the driver examining my truck, circling it slowly as if looking for a reason, any reason, to haul it away. There was no violations. It was in my driveway, clearly permitted, well within all guidelines. Yet the driver didn't leave until he noticed me watching him. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge me. He simply got back in the tow truck and rolled away as silently as he had arrived. 2 hours later, I received a notice stating that a complaint regarding unauthorized vehicle storage had been filed and was under investigation. No details. No explanation. No name attached. Just another warning. Another attempt to chip away at my composure. From that day forward, Every week brought a new problem, a new rule that seemed designed specifically to back me into a corner. The HOA began nitpicking things they had ignored for years. Things they had approved. Things they had never once mentioned in community guidelines. The first major escalation came with the landscaping citations. It started with my hedges. According to the notice, they exceeded the maximum allowable height by half an inch. Not an inch, not a foot. Half an inch. I measured twice. My tape measure confirmed what common sense already told me. No reasonable person would consider this a violation. But the HOA wasn't acting on reason. 3 days later, I received another citation. This time for having improper mulch distribution. I stood in my yard staring at the ground, wondering how anyone could possibly decide that mulch, placed exactly as it had been every year, was now suddenly unacceptable. It was absurd. Laughable, even, and yet the fines were real. The warnings were real. The threat of legal action was real, and the HOA was just getting warmed up. Soon after, I noticed neighbors slowing their cars whenever they passed my house. Some lingered long enough to take photos. Others stood at the edge of my driveway with their arms folded, pretending to look at their phones while their cameras clicked. It was a strange, invasive feeling, like being observed from behind glass. I didn't know whether they were acting on their own or under instructions from the board. But the effect was the same. I began to feel watched in my own home, monitored every moment of every day. The more I documented their behavior, the more aggressive they became. One morning, I found a violation taped directly onto my front door. A brand new rule passed, effective immediately, that restricted the placement of outdoor tools, garden supplies, and equipment. The irony was impossible to miss. The rule had been created the day after I began expanding my garden. It was retroactive, unfair, and transparently crafted to target me alone. But the most unsettling part wasn't the rule itself. It was what someone had done while posting it. Footprints led from my door across the side of the house, directly into my backyard. There was no reason for anyone to be back there. No inspection scheduled. No notice provided. Yet someone had walked the length of my property, moved things around, and left without a word. That night, I installed cameras. By morning, the HOA had sent me a notice declaring that all exterior surveillance devices require board approval. Another fabricated rule. Another attempt to keep me vulnerable. The cameras stayed up. Because something in me had changed. I was no longer hoping the situation would fade. I was no longer telling myself it was a misunderstanding. I knew what they were doing. Slowly tightening the noose, hoping to push me into a mistake that could justify their escalating attacks. And still, I had no idea why. Meanwhile, the board meetings grew stranger. Though I rarely attended them before, I started showing up just to see what they were discussing behind closed doors. But every time I walked into the room, conversations shifted. Papers were tucked away. Laptops closed. The atmosphere hardened instantly, like my presence alone disrupted some delicate plan. One evening, as I took a seat in the back corner, I watched as the board members exchanged glances. Not annoyed, not surprised, but irritated. Like a secret they were trying to protect had just sprouted a leak. One of them, a woman who never made eye contact, set a stack of documents face down and slid them under a folder the moment I walked in. Another whispered something to Gerald, the president, who responded with a terse nod. Before abruptly changing the meeting agenda, I stayed until the end, waiting for some acknowledgement, some explanation, some clarification about the constant violations. But when the meeting finally adjourned, the board members filed out without a single glance in my direction. Not one of them spoke to me. And the next morning, I received a violation notice for unauthorized attendance, stating that the meeting had been intended for board members and approved guests only. I checked the bylaws. Community members were explicitly allowed. But my violation stood. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a message. The following week, they escalated again. This time, they targeted my trash bins. Apparently, I had placed them 3 inches outside the designated boundary. 3 inches. I stared at the pavement, measuring again and again, wondering if the whole neighborhood was watching from behind blinds, waiting for me to make a single misstep, just so the board could pounce. But what scared me most wasn't the citation. It was the realization that someone had moved the bins themselves. I hadn't placed them in the wrong spot. Someone else had. They weren't just documenting violations. They were creating them. With every new notice, I felt the pressure tighten. What began as minor annoyances had turned into relentless psychological warfare. The board's tone grew more severe, threatening consequences that went far beyond fines, property liens, court action, forced remediation at my expense. It didn't stop there. The HOA started sending contractors to my house, uninvited, unapproved, and without explanation. They'd arrive claiming the board had authorized them to assess compliance issues. When I refused them access, the HOA claimed I was obstructing official inspections. It was a trap. Every refusal became another mark against me. Soon after, I found a notice stating that the board had voted to impose a compliance surcharge on my account due to ongoing non-cooperation. The surcharge was more than my monthly mortgage payment. When I filed a formal challenge, requesting evidence of these alleged violations, the HOA responded with a single sentence: "All evidence will be presented at the appropriate time." The ambiguity was intentional. They were building a case, or the appearance of one, without giving me the opportunity to defend myself. And every day they waited. The tension grew heavier, like a storm cloud that never broke but never moved on. The harassment wasn't limited to board members. Before long, some neighbors joined in. One afternoon, I stepped outside to find someone had scattered lawn clippings across my driveway, fresh ones, despite the fact that my own yard hadn't been mowed in days. Another time, someone tossed loose gravel into the gutter near my property line, a small act, but enough for the HOA to issue a warning about yard debris. It didn't matter that the debris had been planted there. What mattered was that the HOA could use it. Even the mail became unreliable. Important documents arrived opened or taped shut. Some disappeared entirely. A few were returned to sender with claims I had refused delivery. The HOA insisted their letters were being delivered properly. But I could see the pattern. Anything that benefited them arrived without issue. Anything that helped me mysteriously vanished. Every piece of communication sharpened a new edge. Every inspection, every violation, every stranger lurking near my property pushed me closer to the truth that this wasn't about aesthetics, or rules, or community standards. Something bigger was happening beneath the surface. One night, around 1 a.m., my cameras caught footage of a board member walking along the side of my house, pausing near my meter box. He wasn't carrying tools. He wasn't performing maintenance. He stood there for a long, uncomfortable moment, long enough to record his face clearly, before walking off into the dark without returning to the street. The next morning, the HOA issued me a notice for suspicious alterations to my meter box. That was the moment something in me hardened. Fear had transformed into anger, confusion into determination. Up until then, I had reacted to each violation individually, trying to stay within the rules, trying to be reasonable, trying not to escalate the situation further. But they weren't interested in fairness. They were interested in control. And the harder I tried to comply, the more they twisted the rules around me. So I did something they never expected. I began investigating them. I documented every notice, every incident, every suspicious encounter. I made copies of bylaws, amendments, and letters. I researched state HOA regulations. I pulled up property records, financial statements, and board election histories. And the deeper I dug, the more irregularities I found. Missing funds, questionable expenditures, inconsistencies in annual reports, and rules that seemed to appear and disappear without proper approval. That agenda I found under my doormat. It wasn't the only document mishandled or misfiled. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, of pages the board never expected a homeowner to examine. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture came into focus. The garden bed wasn't the issue. The trash bins weren't the issue. None of the citations mattered. I wasn't being punished for breaking rules. I was being punished because I had unknowingly stepped into something the HOA needed to keep hidden. A financial pattern, a paper trail, a discrepancy involving community funds. Something worth over $50 million. But at that point, I still didn't know the full scale. All I knew was that the board was escalating faster, growing more brazen, more reckless. My mailbox filled with threats. My property was monitored at all hours. Neighbors whispered behind my back. Anonymous notes appeared on my porch warning me to drop it and let the board handle things. And then, the most chilling escalation of all, a letter stating that the HOA was preparing to place a lion on my home. Not because of unpaid dues, not because of legitimate violations, but because of fabricated fines, hundreds of them, stacked one on top of another, until they reached a number no reasonable homeowner could ever manage. It was a strategy, a trap, a way to force me out. But the board didn't know what I had found. They didn't know what I was about to uncover next. And they certainly didn't know that the very evidence they had tried to bury was the same evidence that would eventually unravel everything they built. They thought they had me cornered. They thought their rules, their intimidation, their fabricated violations would break me. But all they did was push me closer to the truth. And the moment I discovered the missing piece, the document that explained everything, the HOA crossed a line they could never step back from. A line that would turn this quiet neighborhood dispute into a full-scale war. A war they were certain they would win. A war they had no idea they were about to lose. The discovery didn't come from a whistleblower, a confession, or a dramatic confrontation. It came from a mistake, an oversight so small the board never imagined it would matter. A single misplaced page inside a stack of old annual reports, yellowed at the corners and folded like someone had hastily shoved it away to avoid dealing with it. I found it while digging through a binder the HOA kept in a locked cabinet at the community center. A binder they claimed held only general meeting summaries and outdated landscaping recommendations. A binder they waved off as non-essential when I requested financial transparency. But the lock wasn't difficult to bypass, and once inside, I discovered papers in complete disarray. Some pages missing dates, others missing signatures, and many missing entirely. Near the back, tucked between finance summaries from nearly a decade ago, sat the page that changed everything. A ledger. Not a full record, just a single page of transactions totaling over $2 million. But the strangest part wasn't the amount. It was where the money went a private contracting company with no website, no physical office, and a name that matched the last name of a former board member. A company that, according to local business records, had dissolved years before the payments were made. A company that didn't exist anymore. But the HOA had still been funneling money into it. The numbers didn't lie. The signatures didn't lie. The transfers didn't lie. And for the first time, I understood why they wanted me silent, why they wanted me overwhelmed, why they wanted me gone. The garden beds, the mulch, the trash bins, none of it mattered. What mattered was preventing anyone from connecting the dots buried in those old binders. I took photos of everything. Every line. Every signature, every unexplained transfer. When I closed the binder and slid it back into place, my pulse hammered with a mix of fear and clarity. I now possessed the one thing. They never wanted a homeowner to have evidence. But the HOA must have sensed something, because the very next day, they escalated to a level I never thought possible. A notice arrived by certified mail. Thick envelope, heavy paper, official seal. Inside was a document that made my entire body go cold. A foreclosure intent letter. According to the HOA, I had accrued enough unpaid fines, fabricated, inflated, and multiplied many times over, that they were initiating proceedings to seize my home. My home. The place I had built, worked for, improved, and defended. They claimed legal justification. They claimed due process. They claimed authority granted under the community's covenants. But I knew the truth. This wasn't law. It was retaliation. Retaliation for stepping too close to a secret they thought they had buried beyond reach. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not out of fear. Though fear was there, cold and heavy. But out of disbelief that a group of neighbors, armed with nothing more than titles they bestowed upon themselves, believed they had the right to take away everything I had. The quiet fight I had hoped would resolve through persistence and documentation had exploded into a full-scale attack. And this time, I fought back. I compiled every violation, every photograph, every strange incident, every rule change, every fabricated citation, every nighttime intrusion, every shred of financial evidence. I organized it into a timeline, connected patterns, highlighted contradictions. I stayed up for 2 straight nights building the kind of case no board expected a homeowner to prepare. And then I contacted the one person the HOA had hoped I would never reach. A state investigator. HOAs fear one thing above all. Oversight they don't control. I knew the moment I hit send on the email that the board would panic. That they would retaliate. That they would try to cover their tracks. I underestimated how fast they would act. The night before the investigator scheduled a formal interview with me, a pounding hit my front door at nearly midnight. Not a knock. Pounding. Hard, insistent, angry. When I approached the door, 3 board members stood under my porch light, arms crossed, faces rigid with fury. Though no words were exchanged, this story contains no dialogue. Their intent was unmistakable. They had come to intimidate me, to force compliance, to bully me into silence one last time. I didn't open the door. I simply recorded everything until they eventually left, their shadows disappearing into the dark like a threat not yet fulfilled. The next morning, the board filed an emergency meeting notice. A notice claiming I was in severe violation of multiple covenants and that the community was at risk of financial destabilization because of my noncompliance. Anyone reading it would assume I was a danger to the neighborhood. They weaponized language meant to unite neighbors and twisted it into a tool of public shaming. And it worked. Some neighbors glared as I passed. Others avoided me entirely. A few recorded me from their driveways. as though the board's propaganda had turned me into an enemy of the community. It was surreal. Watching normal people manipulated into believing fiction because it came with an official letterhead. But I didn't have time to correct their assumptions. Because the investigator arrived. I met with him in the community center's small conference room. Neutral territory. The same place where the board whispered behind closed doors and pretended their authority was untouchable. I laid everything out. The timeline. The harassment. The phony violations. The financial records. The ledger page with the dead company receiving payments. The signatures that didn't match. The suspicious surcharges. The forged attendance violation. The retroactive rules. The lien threats. The missing mail. The nighttime intrusions. I showed him everything. And for the first time since this nightmare began, someone listened. Not with skepticism. Not with defensiveness. Not with the cold indifference the board had perfected. He listened with concern. By the end of the meeting, he told me he'd be contacting the board for immediate interviews. He didn't have to explain the significance. The board was in serious trouble. What I didn't expect was how they would respond, because when people in power feel that power slipping through their fingers, they stop playing by their own rules. They stop pretending to be reasonable. They stop hiding behind bylaws and committee titles. They panic. And panicked people make mistakes. The emergency meeting they held that evening, open to the community, should have been routine. A structured, organized performance of authority they could rehearse with precision. But when I entered the room, binder in hand, camera recording, something shifted. The board was visibly rattled. Gerald, the president, looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Papers in front of him were stacked unevenly, trembling each time he moved his hands. Two board members whispered in harsh, frantic tones, pointing at their phones, at printouts, at me. The community sat in folding chairs, unsuspecting, waiting for answers. What they got was a meltdown. The board attempted to justify every violation thrown at me, each claim weaker than the last. They referenced rules that didn't exist, dates that didn't align, signatures that didn't match. They contradicted themselves. They contradicted each other. Their facade of authority began to crumble in real time. And then I presented the ledger. The room fell silent, not because of confrontation, but because the truth hit like a physical force. Homeowners stared. Some gasped. Others exchanged confused looks. The board tried to grab the papers from my hand, but I had already placed copies on a table where everyone could see. That was the moment everything snapped. The board couldn't hide it anymore. Couldn't spin it. Couldn't bury it. They tried to downplay the numbers. They tried to redirect blame to former members. They tried to claim clerical errors. But the more they talked, the more obvious it became. They had been siphoning money. For years. Through shell companies. Through fake invoices. Through projects that never existed. My garden bed hadn't started a conflict. It had exposed a fracture in their system. A fracture that led to a secret so large the board had turned my life into a maze of harassment, simply to keep me from asking questions. And the investigator, standing quietly in the back, witnessed it all. When he stepped forward, clipboard in hand, the board members froze. They didn't expect him to be there. They didn't expect the community to hear what he was about to say. They didn't expect consequences to arrive so publicly, so suddenly, so powerfully. He announced that a formal audit had been opened, that the HOA was under investigation for financial misconduct, that board operations were being suspended pending review, that any enforcement action against me, including foreclosure, was legally frozen. The room erupted. Homeowners who had been silent for years began demanding explanations. Some shouted. Some cried. Some stood in stunned disbelief, as the people they trusted to protect the community were exposed for exploiting it. Decades of frustration poured out in a tidal wave the board could no longer control. Gerald attempted one final stand, an attempt to regain authority, to talk over the chaos, to restore order. But the words didn't hold power anymore. The titles, the rules, the entire structure they had built meant nothing under the weight of the truth, now hanging in the air. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I didn't feel alone. The board's authority fractured. Their composure shattered. Their control evaporated. The meeting ended not with a formal adjournment, but with the board retreating, scattering out of the room like cornered animals, clutching folders, avoiding eye contact, leaving behind the wreckage of their collapsed empire. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, as neighbors approached me with apologies and stunned gratitude, one overwhelming realization settled in. This wasn't over. The board had been exposed. But exposure wasn't justice. Not yet. The investigation was only beginning. The money trail extended far deeper than one ledger page. And the consequences, legal, financial, and personal, were still to come. But for the first time, the power dynamics had shifted. The HOA had thrown everything at me to protect their secret. Intimidation, surveillance, fines, lies, threats. They tried to break me to protect themselves. And they failed. Now the truth was out. Now the community knew. Now the system they weaponized was turning against them. My fight wasn't finished, but the tide had turned. And the next chapter wouldn't be about surviving their attacks. It would be about what happened when the truth finally came home to collect. In the days following the catastrophic board meeting, the night their empire cracked open in full view of the community, the neighborhood felt different. Not calmer, not safer, not settled, but suspended in a strange, heavy silence, like a storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape still trembling from the force of what it had endured. People walked slower, spoke in hushed tones, avoided long glances. For years, they had accepted the HOA's authority as an immutable part of daily life. Something that governed the rhythm of the neighborhood, whether they liked it or not. Now that illusion had shattered. And all of it had started with a garden bed and a stack of papers they never intended anyone to see. The morning after the investigator froze all enforcement actions, I woke up for the first time in months without a violation notice taped to my door. Without the sound of someone skulking around my yard. Without the creeping anxiety that something new had been fabricated overnight. My home felt like my home again. Not a stage for harassment or a battleground for petty tyranny, but a place where I could breathe without waiting for the next blow. Still, I knew better than to assume it was over. Corruption doesn't dissolve in a single night. It clings, it fights, it thrashes on its way out. And though the board had been stripped of immediate authority, they hadn't disappeared. They were still out there. Silent, desperate, scrambling to cover themselves before the investigation dug deeper. But something had changed. They no longer held the narrative. The homeowners did. By midday, small groups formed along the sidewalks and cul-de-sacs, neighbors comparing stories, piecing together years of small injustices, odd fines, unexplained fees, and suspicious charges. Things they had brushed off or forgotten now stood out as glaring red flags. Homeowners who had once stayed quiet out of convenience or fear now found themselves emboldened by a shared realization. The board hadn't been enforcing order, it had been abusing power. And the community wanted answers. Over the next several days, The investigator worked methodically. He conducted interviews, collected statements, requested financial documents, and ordered a full audit going back nearly 15 years. Trucks arrived carrying boxes of archived HOA records, some disorganized, some missing, some suspiciously pristine. What was once a private network of secret decisions and manufactured violations had become an open display of forensic digging. Homeowners peeked out windows as officials carried armfuls of binders into the community center's side office, one after another, like evidence being gathered for a trial. Meanwhile, the board members attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. No one trusted them, no one spoke to them, no one rallied in their defense. They avoided public spaces, avoided eye contact, avoided even walking their dogs during daylight. Their empire had crumbled, and with it, the illusion of invincibility they had weaponized for so long. The first concrete breakthrough came when the preliminary audit results were released to the community. The numbers were staggering. Over $6 million in unaccounted expenditures. Millions more routed through suspicious vendors and shell entities. Dozens of invoices for work never performed. Contracts awarded without bids, without oversight, without even legitimate justification. Funds withdrawn with signatures the auditor could not verify as authentic. And that was only the first round. As the pages stacked higher, the truth grew clearer. The HOA hadn't simply mismanaged funds. It had orchestrated a long-term, calculated siphoning scheme, one that spanned multiple board terms, multiple presidents, multiple treasurers. It wasn't the work of one person, but a chain of individuals passing the torch of corruption from one to another, each adding their own layer of deceit. My case, my conflict, had been nothing more than a speed bump in their operation, a problem to eliminate before I stumbled into the one set of documents that exposed the thread connecting everything, and I had pulled the thread hard enough for the entire fabric to unravel. As the investigation intensified, so did the consequences. One by one, board members received notices to appear for formal questioning. Subpoenas followed. Some resigned quietly, hoping disappearance would save them. Others lawyered up. A few attempted to claim ignorance, insisting they were only following instructions from their predecessors. But the paper trail, spotty as it was, told a different story. The state investigator wasn't the only one watching. Homeowners attended every available hearing, sitting in rows like silent witnesses to a reckoning long overdue. Their presence alone spoke volumes. A reminder that the board's authority came not from power, but from the trust they had violated. And as for me, my role shifted entirely. Where I had once been the board's favorite target, I was now their greatest liability. The investigator met with me multiple times, each meeting longer and more detailed than the last. The evidence I had compiled formed the backbone of the audit's timeline. My documentation of the fabricated violations revealed patterns of board retaliation. My recordings of nighttime intrusions showed intent. My timeline of fines and rule changes exposed how the board had weaponized policy to protect their scheme. I became the central witness, and the board knew it. Some neighbors remained cautious, unsure how to approach me, after months of watching me endure harassment. Others apologized, explaining they had been too afraid to speak up, too afraid of becoming targets themselves. I didn't hold it against them. The board thrived by isolating people, by convincing them they were alone, by making examples out of those who resisted. Fear was the board's most powerful weapon. And now that weapon was gone. But the most unexpected shift came from the community's reaction. Not just to the corruption, but to what I had endured. Neighbors I barely knew began dropping off food, tools, offers to help repair the damage caused by months of board intrusion. People who hadn't spoken to me in years now stopped by to check in, to offer support, to share their own experiences that they'd kept quiet out of fear. What the board had built was never a community. It was a controlled environment, and without their control, a real community finally began to form. But justice moves slower than outrage. It took months for the investigation to reach its full conclusion. Months of waiting. Months of uncertainty. Months where I braced myself for retaliation from the remnants of the board, even though they no longer held power. I lived with cameras still running, documents still locked away, evidence still backed up in multiple locations. And then, one crisp morning, the final report arrived. Everything was laid bare. The fraud totaled nearly $50 million over the span of 15 years. The board had orchestrated unauthorized contracts, inflated maintenance fees, and funneled funds into personal accounts. Former board members who had moved away were implicated. Bank statements traced money to vacations, home remodels, vehicles, and investments. What I had uncovered was only the tip of a vast, carefully constructed operation. The state filed charges. Several board members were arrested. Some accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony. Others fought the accusations and lost. The community watched as the very people who once claimed they were protecting property values were escorted out of courtrooms in handcuffs. The HOA as it had existed was dissolved. A state-appointed management company took temporary control, while the community elected a new board under strict oversight. Policies were rewritten. Transparency requirements were implemented. Annual audits became mandatory. The old guard's rules, those twisted tools they had used to manipulate and intimidate, were erased from the bylaws. My fabricated fines were not only dismissed, they were formally expunged from the record. Every violation the board had ever issued against me was voided. And though vindication felt powerful, it didn't undo the months of fear, stress, isolation, or financial strain. Healing wasn't instantaneous, but it began. As for my home, I kept it. The foreclosure threat evaporated the moment the investigation began. But even long after, I occasionally stood on my porch, looking at the raised garden beds, the repainted trim, the carefully placed gravel paths, and reminded myself that this place, this land, didn't belong to those who tried to take it. It belonged to me. But the impact of everything that happened didn't stop at my property line. The community changed. Homeowners began attending meetings regularly, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. They asked questions. They demanded explanations. They no longer accepted vague answers or rushed votes or private discussions behind closed doors. The new board wasn't made up of power-hungry opportunists, but cautious volunteers determined not to repeat history. The neighborhood grew quieter, but in a different way, a healthier way. People no longer watched each other to report violations. They watched out for one another. The tension that once buzzed beneath the surface was gone, and the people who had once stood by silently began to find their voices. Even the investigator, during his final visit to the neighborhood, remarked that my case would become a training example for spotting early signs of HOA abuse. Not because it was unusual, but because it was more common than most people realized. But the greatest impact wasn't the arrests, or the audits, or the policy changes. It was what I learned about standing alone. Because there were moments, too many moments, where giving up felt like the easiest path. Moments where the weight of their lies and threats and pressure felt like it could crush me. Moments where I questioned whether confronting an entire system was worth the risk. But every time they pushed, every time they tried to silence me, every time they fabricated another violation to force me into submission, they underestimated something far stronger than their rules. Determination. The refusal to accept injustice, even when it wears the costume of authority. The refusal to be intimidated by titles or paperwork or threats. The refusal to let the truth be buried under bureaucracy and fear. And that's the irony of what happened. The board spent years perfecting their system of control. But in the end, it wasn't their power that defined the outcome. It was their corruption, their greed, their arrogance. And the very homeowner they tried hardest to silence became the one who exposed everything they built. The HOA wasn't destroyed by a scandal. It was destroyed by the truth. A truth they tried to bury under fabricated rules, manufactured violations, and relentless harassment. But the truth has a way of resurfacing. Even in the quietest neighborhoods, even under the watchful eyes of those who believe themselves untouchable. And sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away. So if there's one lesson in all of this, one takeaway that stayed with me long after the dust settled, it's simple. When powerful people expect you to break, standing your ground becomes the most powerful act of all. And now, I can't help but wonder, if you discovered your HOA was hiding something this big, would you fight back too?